The young man stood defiantly on those hay bales, standing up as tall as he could so that when I stood straight up, he was looking me in the eyes. I told him about our group and that we needed to find a place that we could sustain. He seemed to understand, and I could see in his eyes that he was in the same situation. Not only that, but even with the layers of clothing, I could see that he was pretty fiercely emaciated. As we talked, I could see movement from the hay. I can only figure that they were trying to get a good look at me. Also, I could hear them talking to each other, but it was far too low for me to hear. Regardless of that, the young man kept his eyes locked on me and his finger on the trigger the entire conversation. The only time he seemed to relax was when I told him that more than half of my group were fully human. Also, the fact that we had a bunch of children with us made him look at me with more of an inquisitive face than one of fear and rage. Eventually, we got on the subject to the farms nearby. He took it kind of hard when I told him about the one that burned out, guessing he had either a friend living there or there was a girl he was kind of sweet on. Either way, I could see him fighting tears as I continued. Although he had been holding out hope about the surrounding area, it was clear that they were the last holdouts. When I said that the kid was smart, I wasn't kidding. He brought up the fact that he could not protect all the young ones he had by himself, especially with the winter only a few months out. That is when we started bartering for the buildings. It was clear that he wanted the stuff from the larger group into the smaller buildings, and that is when I reminded him that not only was my group bigger, but I cannot take off and take flight to the air from a one-story building without seriously risking crashing right into the ground, which doesn't feel good. The second floor deck would be the best place for me, though he started to argue and he relented once I mentioned that he could get the farm up and running with those many personnel. This made him pause and simply think about the whole situation. We did go back and forth for a while, almost until dusk, until he finally agreed on terms. We would keep the transformed personnel away from his group until he could tell that they were not a threat to him or his small group. My group would get the big house, and his group would take the middle sized one. The smallest one would be for the kitty couple, if they decide to join us, that is. The foodstuffs would be kept in the barns along with working vehicles. This was for camouflage purposes. We would start to harvest any remaining crops, hay, firewood, and any other resources as soon as possible, making sure we would have enough and would be able to last until the next harvest, and that would be key. I suggested that we build a greenhouse to aid in the early planting, but getting the materials for that would be difficult at best. I would be sleeping in the house that night, and I would fly to get everyone in the morning. Before I left, I told them not to worry about the mess in the kitchen. We'll clean it up when we arrive, and it'll be about 3 days to a week. He lowered his head a little before nodding and waving me goodbye. I didn't have the heart to tell him that we wouldn't be able to sleep. Instead, I waited until dark and checked my compass before taking to the skies once again. Traveling at night is peaceful. Since there's no aircraft, I could just glide silently across the sky and enjoy the clear air and a few lights around. Of course, there were still a few bugs, but my hide was so thick they couldn't pierce them. So, bite me, you mosquitoes. But no, wait, you can't. Haha. And I would be arriving back at the complex in the morning. With the first light of the day, I landed on the ground between the two buildings we were using. The guard on duty was a bit surprised, but still came out to welcome me back. He had a few questions, and I was happy to answer them. But first, we had to get all the adults awake so that I could lay everything out for them. Plus, I didn't want to explain the situation 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. During breakfast, I informed them that I had found us a place, and that I already had inhabitants. Everyone was on edge about that last part until I told them that they were just kids. Pulling out a map, I showed them where it was and what else I had seen on my trip. The destroyed property, the non human squatters, even the condition of the roads. With some help, we could figure out the best route to go while not being seen or running into possibly some unfriendly territory. The trip would take us about 4 hours of driving to get there. This is where we found our first issue, which was fuel. We would have to get extra fuel to take us and take with us if we wanted to get there. The cars wouldn't be a problem, but the trucks loaded with supplies and provisions would be a whole nother matter. This would take me and the other men another day or two at the least in order to siphon enough fuel to get us to our destination and maybe have a little bit extra, just in case. Making sure we ate hearty the night before, we had snacks for the road and made sure everyone got plenty of sleep. I wasn't tired yet, so I would be patrolling through the night. As I circled, I kept seeing the vehicles lined up and ready to go. If everyone was watching, it would be pretty clear that we were getting ready to leave. The only other person I saw that night was the tomcat of the kitty couple. He went outside to relieve himself and waved at me before he went back inside. With our vision, we could see each other just fine, although I wasn't going to watch him take a leak. With the first glimmer of dawn approaching, I landed and woke everyone up. The children were half asleep as we carried them to the vehicles. One of the girls, as in one of my consorts, asked me what was wrong as I paused looking at one of the cars being loaded. I told her it was nothing and got back to work, but in truth I wished I could drive my car again. It is amazing how much you miss certain things once you can't do them anymore. Before the sun had broken the horizon, the convoy began on its journey. We had decided on making this trip during the day because we didn't want to put extra risk in traveling at night. The fact was that it was nearly a new moon and the headlights would be required. To anyone looking, it would be a huge "come and get me" beacon, and we didn't want that. At least during the day, our noise was the biggest signal. Well, that and me gliding above, though this time I would be in full armor. We made it to the interstate all right. This is where we would take our time. The big truck would be the one setting the pace, since it was, of course, the slowest vehicle. The entire time, I kept thinking of the convoys that crossed the Atlantic in World War II. This put me even more on edge, even though the road was almost completely clear. When they got off the exit, they would use the front of the pickup truck to push the few cars out of the way. Thankfully, we only had to do this a few times. The fourth time we came up to one of these blockades or blockages, I could tell something was just wrong. It was off. I didn't know why, but it just was. There were far more vehicles in the intersection than there should be. It shouldn't be blocked in like that. There was no way around due to the topography of the building, so the only way was through it. I was confused since I didn't see this when I first came through. The group took its time to refuel the big vehicles as others began to move the blockage. This, with many personnel, didn't take as long to get many of the vehicles underway. I still didn't like how it looked. Maybe it was a side effect of my time being deployed, but this just didn't seem right. How were there so many vehicles in this one spot if they could be moved so easily? Why this area of all places? Why were so many of the tall vehicles like trucks turned on? Oh shit. I tucked my wings in and began to dive. I tried to warn them. I wanted to get them ready. I wanted so badly to get them out of that trap. Creatures jumped out from behind cover and began to rush the group. These creatures were large, very large, and moved very fast for their size. Their dark brown fur had camouflaged them from me, and now I had to do what I could. Diving down, I was about halfway to the ground when the first shots rang out. Those little 9mm rounds didn't even seem to penetrate those big bastards as they just kept coming. The women ran back to the vehicles as the men tried to withdraw while firing. One of the big hairy things jumped up to the roof of a vehicle and jumped at one of the women. Two of the felines caught it in midair and started to tear at it. This is when I realized how big they truly were. Even though it would only take a few seconds for me to reach them, I could clearly see that the felines though tall for a human female, averaging 5'10", 5'11", looked like a 5-year-old wrestling their father. Though they had knocked the hairy thing to the side, saving the women, this thing still had plenty of fight in it. Just as I was about to reach the first one closest to me, I drew my insect's blades and turned myself into the streamlined bullet. The creature closest to me noticed me just in time to get both blades impaled into its chest. Even with this, the impact of my weight and being caught off guard, this thing still had enough to stay on its feet, at least for a few moments. I looked up at it and was shocked at what I saw. This creature was one of those bearish things I had fought before. The damn thing must have stood at least 11 feet tall, and with its arms clearly big enough to crush me if it had a chance. Thankfully, it didn't get one. As I lifted its head, it screamed in pain and suddenly erupted with a small volcano of blood. Looking at where I had pierced, both lungs must have been filled with blood almost immediately. I tried to pull the blades out, but found them stuck as the bear thing dropped to its knees. I raised my legs and used leverage to rip the blades out of the creature. Another spray of blood came out, covering the entire ventral side, and I even got some of it in my mouth, much to my discomfort. Looking up, I could see a melee of men shooting, along with the creatures flailing and biting and slashing at each other. I ran to the next one, which had not noticed me, and swung the bug blade diagonally down at its neck. The blade sunk deep enough to stick in as the blood gushed from the severed artery. This time, the creature was able to scream, which drew the others. There was a moment where we looked at each other in shock, though what shocked me was the limp feline body hanging from its mouth of the one furthest away to my right. Before, this was just business. Now, this is fucking personal. In a blind rage, I charged at least those three bearish things still on their feet. The first one seemed to back up a bit as I used the nearest vehicle as a springboard and dove at it blade first. I tried to swing with its arm, but found that my blade stuck through its forearm. He didn't miss either, as I found myself slammed into the side of our big truck. This only fazed me for a second as it charged at it again. It was busy trying to get the bug blade out of its arm as I jumped onto its chest, striking with my claws into its body as deep as I could, wrapping my tail around its shoulder. I released my hand and claws and proceeded to slash and bite at its neck. It retaliated by trying to swat me off with its good arm, and then it bit me hard. The teeth sunk into my shoulder as I continued to slash out of sheer rage. A few seconds later, blood was spraying out in all directions as the bite into my shoulder loosened. As it let go and dropped to the ground, I could hear very loud shots being fired. I turned and someone had finally reached the shotguns. They were unloading shot after shot into one of these creatures that shuddered and stepped back with every shot. The double-aught buckshot was able to pierce the hide, but not enough to come out the back. For a moment, it looked like a scene from one of those old science fiction movies, but I couldn't enjoy the show. The last one had reached me, and with a massive bear paw swung and sent me flying again. This time I bounced off the side and roof of a wagon and rolled over to the other side. By the time I was getting to my feet, it was walking around the front of the car. That hit took a lot out of me, and I was sure I was dead. That is when I noticed the blood around its muzzle. From then on, nothing mattered to me except ripping this thing apart. It tried to swing down in order to crush me, but I spun away to the left and ended up right next to it. The massive backhand almost got me as I ducked and went for the sensitive areas. It was amazing how fast everything will withdraw when it's damaging the goods. With a quick swipe of my foot and talons, I cut right across his junk, which made it immediately step back and grab for its crotch. This was my chance, and I used my hands to swing across the side of the abdomen just below the ribs. This resulted in me coming away with a part of its hide and muscles in my hand. This made it double over, so I jumped on its back and drove my claws into each side of its neck. I dug in as deep that it must have reached both arteries. I ripped out as much as I could with both hands, and blood sprayed from both sides of the neck. The fountain of blood must have reached 10 to 15 feet at first before the creature just collapsed. Turning around, breathing heavy, and knowing a world of pain would come later, I could see members of the group coming over as they reloaded their weapons. They asked if I was all right, and I just stumbled past them to see what they had done to us. The kitty couple had been beaten pretty hard, but would recover. The humans were more traumatized than hurt, even though stitches would be required for a few of them. My two human girls were in the vehicles trying to comfort the children. My feline companions were around the body of one of their own. The one that originally couldn't talk when I first met her was holding the body as she looked up at me. She was crying as her eyes said, "Do something," which I couldn't. The body had been mangled and her neck was clearly broken. Even if the bearish thing hadn't bitten down on her neck, the sheer number of injuries would have made her die of shock or blood loss, or both. The two youngest Mollies held on to each other and cried, even as they both dripped blood on the ground. The youngest even had a clearly broken leg, which I knew had to be splinted. I've lived through this sort of thing before, so I knew what needed to be done. I grabbed one of the medical bags and began to get to work on the injured. As I did, the two females kept the children's eyes hidden from the worst of it, and I'm glad for that, since they had gotten close to the Mollies recently. My human companions helped me get the wounds dressed and the injured into the vehicles. While this was happening, the men asked me if I was okay, and the women asked how I could be so heartless, as I had not shown any emotion or spoke much after the battle. I didn't answer, but the men helped me out by telling the women to take care of the children. We grabbed lumber from the trucks, at least what lumber we could find from the disabled vehicles that had been overturned, and set up a platform on the middle of the damaged vehicles. Once that was done, we moved the body, and after retrieving one of my blades, I punched one of the fuel tanks of the nearby vehicles. We circled up as one of the men prayed, while another tried to hand me a book of matches. I say tried. I had to hold my claws as I remembered that I just didn't have the dexterity to do that anymore. He nodded, pulled out one match, and struck it before lighting the rest of the book and throwing it at the fire. It didn't take more than a second before the fuel to ignite, and we all got in the vehicles to leave. As we drove away, the fuel tanks of the vehicles began to blow. I was in the back of a pickup truck now facing the funeral pyre. All I could think of was, I sure hope nothing else happens on the way to that farm.